Hello and welcome to the Modern Fairy Sightings Podcast, where we listen to people's fairy encounters. But take heed, we're not talking about winged Tinkerbells here. These are real fairies, real encounters that took people like you and I by surprise. Stay a while and hear their stories. My name is Jo Hickey Hall, and I'm a folklore researcher. Dear listener, I hope you're well. This week has been sad and unsettling for many people in Britain and around the world. We're moving into what will literally be a new era. Along with all of the other changes that have taken place in the last few years, these times, and particularly big news like this, adds to the state of liminality that we're currently experiencing and living through. In these times, and particularly going into these darker months, I find it helpful to ground as much as possible through meditations and healing practices. And when I have my own spare time, doing only the things I really want to do, those that feel meaningful, with people that I actually want to spend time with. So give yourself permission to do what feels best for you at the moment. Here in Britain we are moving into autumn. Nature starts to give off a sense of beginning to bed down and conserve energy, preparing for the months ahead. And I feel like doing the same. This episode begins with a gentle story about a childhood fairy friend and ends with a very intriguing tale of a visitation from a fairy fiddler. I'll be reading some excerpts from Seeing Fairies by Marjorie Johnson. On the bonus episode for patrons on Patreon, I'm sharing an audio recording of a choral evensong which I recorded last Saturday in Canterbury Cathedral. My husband and I had some time off together, and inspired by Paul Devereux and Ian Thompson's book The Lay Hunter's Companion, we walked the ley line from Chartham to the cathedral. Thank you very much for all your messages, which I've loved reading. I'm slightly behind in getting back to people, so bear with me. And thank you very much to my dear patrons who support the project. I look forward to catching up in a couple of weeks. I hope you enjoy this episode. I'll join you for a chat at the end.
Time to
I'm actually on the Maryland Eastern Shore. So if you know the East Coast of the United States, you know where Washington, D.C. is.
Oh, right.
Just east of Washington, D.C. is the Chesapeake Bay. And then across the Chesapeake Bay is the Eastern Shore, and that's Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. That goes down about the size of America. The Eastern, it's about the distance between Ireland and England. You know, I grew up around here, Chesapeake Bay area. You would not think this is the kind of place that you would run into the Fae.
Really?
Really. So, go ahead.
They turn up in the strangest of places, though, don't they? In the most unexpected places.
Yes, yes. And I think once you've been touched by them or found one or had an experience, it kind of sticks with you. And other things happen.
I think you're right. It's an interesting point that once you've kind of crossed that threshold, you tend to have other experiences. And it's funny that people that report certain experiences, they tend to have multiple experiences.
You also get hungry for it and you want another and another. The two that I had were, one was definitely just me. The other one was led by my son and continued through my family till the death of my previous wife. But I have never met anybody else who's had an experience, And I'm an engineer by trade. And by avocation, I'm a musician and a performer at the Renaissance fairs and things like that. And I meet a lot of posers, a lot of people who are party pagans, and People say, "Oh yes, I have the power and I can see," and they don't. And when you ask them questions, and well, have you ever seen a fairy? Have you ever seen a ghost, an elf, a spirit, or whatever? Oh, no, 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 but I know they're there. It was wonderful, but it's hard to find people who have actually seen it.
Oh, well, there are lots. I mean, I speak to people all the time, and I have a Patreon where most people on there have seen fairies, and we get to talk about it. And so if you ever want to join us, just join us.
Okay.
It's a really nice group, and we just kind of get to talk really frankly about it. And it really helps actually, because I know that feeling. You can't talk to everybody about it.
Right.
Particularly if, as you say, you have some kind of responsible position or job, and people just don't really understand these things a lot of the time. I mean, even if they love us and they want to understand, it's very difficult for people to understand
Right.
unless they've kind of experienced it themselves. So yeah, I totally sympathize with with that sense. But yeah, I agree as well. There are lots of people who are, very much let's say into magic, and for whatever reason, they're just not visual. Like
Right.
maybe they connect in other ways, but they don't seem to be able to see these things.
Hmm.
It's not to say that they won't someday, but then there's so many people out there walking down the street, and that are not into these things
Oh yeah.
whatsoever, and then
Right.
they've seen a fairy.
Hmm.
So it doesn't necessarily follow that if you're into all of that you do see them.
That's very true. Yeah. I look at it more as like a blessing. You know.
Absolutely.
And like I said earlier, it makes you hunger for more and a deeper connection.
It
Yeah.
does. It does. Have you tried drinking? I don't know if you're into kind of teas, but one of the guys that I interviewed, he taught us on Patreon group. He came and taught us about Chinese teas. They're called fairy teas. Now, they're really ancient Chinese teas, and a bit like with mushrooms or any other substance
Right.
that gets you into an altered state. This is what the tea does. They're really powerful. And he taught us how to perform a ritual with it just on your own, just a bit of tea, and the way to hold it. And
Well, actually, the first touch was, and it's going to sound horrible for your research, was hallucinogenically induced.
that
It
is absolutely fine.
was in southern Mississippi when I was in the forces, and we made some tea from mushrooms.
Mm.
And the journey that it took me on, I ended up sitting in um, around a campfire, like a council fire, with these giant squirrels, black one, a red one, a white one, and a brown one, and me, all sitting around this fire. And they were talking about how important the earth was, and how important it was to be stewards, and how important it was to respect nature and so forth. All the things that I've been raised with.
Mm.
And at the end of the vision, they all morphed into a black, a white, a brown, and me, human-like beings.
Healing has helped me many times in my life when I'd reached a point where something needed to change. In 2005, I trained with Martin Brofman to learn the body mirror system of healing, which was life-changing for me. It's based on the idea that the parts of your body that don't work well reflect the parts of your life that don't work well, and about which you have tension in your consciousness. The understanding is that tension is stress, and stress causes symptoms. In a distance healing or in-person session, I move up the chakras, returning each one to wholeness using a colour map. During the process, I see images and situations, I hear words or receive impressions that tell me something about what caused the tension in that person's life. The feedback at the end of the session is a really big part of the healing. If you're interested in a chakra healing session, you can contact me at scarletofthefae@gmail.com.
and then he just kind of poofed away. So being the pragmatic man I was at the time, I thought, okay, that's like just great. I had I had an experience, great and wonderful. Years later, my wife and my son and I had been posted to Ireland, to Dublin. We were posted to South Dublin, actually Black Rock. I was working in Dublin itself. And we used to go to church at the Black Rock Catholic Church, and then go to breakfast, and then go to Black Rock Market. One Sunday morning, my son got up, and unlike most 4.5-year-old, 5-year-old kids, no, I guess that was third grade by then, because we'd already been to Australia, so it must have been 7, yeah, maybe 7, going on 8, I guess. He got up and decided to wear a suit to church. And he put on his little suit and his little tie and everything else, and we trundled off to church. After church, we went to having breakfast, and we went to the Black Rock Market. And as we're roaming through the market, it's a market like any market in England. So it's not, a farmer's market or anything else. Everything's there. I'm lost in the used books. My wife's lost in the furniture. Then we realized we both lost Brendan. We couldn't figure out where he was, which for a parent is the most horrific feeling in the world.
I know.
And we're running around and we're looking around, and then we see him standing, talking to this elderly Irish woman who's bending down to him. And if you can picture Aunt May from Peter Pan. Okay. Brendan. Yeah. We're in a very earnest conversation. And then she gave him an Irish penny, and he came running over to us. I got a penny. Well, what were you talking about? And he said, fairies. We said, what? He said, yes, she told me where to go find fairies. And so my wife and I are laughing about it. We had nothing planned for Sunday anyway. So we went home, we all changed clothes, and we said, okay, Brendan, tell us where she told you to go. So here's my 7-year-old kid in the back of the car. We're driving down the A1. We make a right-hand turn to go up into, what's the name of that place? It's one of Brendan's locations. Anyway, we followed his directions explicitly. We turned off on a small track, turned off to a dirt track, came to a specific gate of a color that he told us the color would be before we got there. We opened up the gate, drove the car through, down a winding track to a specific tree that he knew about, that he recognized, parked the car, got out of the car, walked down, and there's this little brook flowing through. And the brook is flowing. It's got about, I don't know, 1 meter to 1 meter deep sides to it, all undercut with the roots and everything in there and so forth. And Brendan's just running around saying, I'm going to catch a fairy. I'm going to catch a fairy. And then he says, I got one, and okay, great. At this point, my wife and I are thinking like, yeah, okay, imaginary friend, so forth and so on. Get in the car to go back home. All the way back home, he's talking to this thing we couldn't see, right? Yeah. About, what is this? What's going on? Oh, really? And having a whole conversation. We only hear his side of it. We get home, and this goes on for a couple weeks, and then it slowly dies down. But every once in a while, we finally asked him, well, what was the name of your friend? He said, Prickleaf. Okay, so that's cool.
That's very cool.
He would say, Prickleaf's here, or Prickleaf's going to come down, or Prickleaf's with me outside, or whatever. So we went to Glastonbury to see the Holy Well. And of course, I'm an Arthurian by heart. And so we went to Glastonbury to see the monuments and everything in the tour. But and we stayed at a bed and breakfast that was above a little shop. The shop was a fairy shop. Right. Okay. Yeah. And so we go downstairs that day, and we're walking around a fairy shop, and Brendan stops at these statues of fairies and says, that's Prickleaf. And we're like, what? So I think I have a picture of Prickleaf. Well, you can look it up. The famous fairy pictures, flower fairies that were done back.
Cicely Mary Barker, flower fairies, yes.
I think it is, yeah. Yeah. It's a holly fairy.
Oh, yeah. Lovely.
That's Prickleaf.
Yes, of course.
So we found a statue of Prickleaf.
Yes.
So we brought him back to Ireland, and he traveled from Ireland with us to Germany, back to America. And finally, my son got older, and Prickleaf was with us, both his statue and Prickleaf. And eventually, my son stopped having his transactions with.
How old was he?
I probably stopped I guess, when he got into 5th grade. That's like 11.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So that seemed to be the end of it. Okay. So fast forward, 2010. My wife gets cancer for the 3rd time. I work at the Maryland Renaissance Fair, part-time. We go to the Renaissance Fair. It's for last time at the fair. And we're walking along, and there's a booth. And from like, I don't know how many yards away, we both see a pillow. We go running up, and it's a needlepoint of prickle leaf. And we got it. Nancy took it home, and she kept it until she died. I still have that and the statue.
That's beautiful. So yeah.
That's the longest one. Now, my experience happened in about 2006 or 2007. I was a stage manager for the Potomac Celtic Festival. So I had the main stage. We had Gaelic Storm, we had Iona, we had a bunch of bands. And so behind the main stage was a clearing about a quarter of a rugby pitch with a tree in the center. Okay. And I go walking out, it was between bands, and there was a fiddler by the tree. And I walked over to the fiddler. And his fiddler had it was a female, but had a very mannish face, a very square jaw, hair done almost like an eagle's feathers going back, and all in green, mottled green, playing a fiddle.
Yeah.
And I said, hey, we're having a session a little later on. You can join us. I play the bodhrán, and you can join in with us. And it just smiled.
Yeah.
And then something happened behind me. I turned around, and I turned around again, and they were gone.
Wow. Yeah, amazing.
And there's no way they could have got across that distance without me seeing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, music brings them. The innocence of children brings them. It's and it gives me chills every time I think of them.
That is incredible. So, with the person under the tree, what was their face like? I mean, they had like a strong jawbone. Do you remember their eyes or
jawbone, a very rectangular face, very pointy nose, very wise, but yet old, but not wrinkly, ugly old. Slightly pointed ears, blonde hair, very tan face, blonde hair feathered back, all feathered back, and very thin, almost bony thin. So
yeah. And how tall?
Well, I stand 5'5", and I wasn't looking down at much of an angle to look into their eyes.
Okay.
So maybe seated, they were at 4.5 feet.
Gosh, yeah.
Probably like a good 6-footer.
Wow, amazing.
Maybe it wasn't an elf. I don't know what it could have been.
Yeah. And you got that eye contact with them?
Yes.
Yeah. So that was back in 2005. And did anything kind of shift in your life around then? Did it mark any kind of transition?
Other than that, well, not in my life per se, but that was the last year for the festival.
Oh.
For the festival to continue. So it kind of stopped my performing life.
Oh, okay.
And when Prickle Leaf showed up again, my wife died 3 years later.
That's very sad. I'm very sorry to hear that.
Life goes on,
Did you get to play your bodhrán later in the evening?
Yes, I did. Yeah, and I still do play. It's not as often.
Yeah. Fabulous. I wish I could. I've got one downstairs that I've had for ages, and occasionally I get it out, but I haven't had time yet to properly learn how to do it. But I've absolutely always loved live music, and yeah, the drum of the bodhrán just sends me somewhere else. In fact, Irish music, because it's in my blood, it really does something to me.
Same with me with Irish, Scots, you'll find the same connection with music from Galicia in Spain too.
Oh, yes. Yes. And the north of France, the
Yes, the Breton
Breton
music.
music. Yeah. Yeah. Really, they all have their flavors, don't they? But I mean, Irish music really just draws me emotionally. But yeah, I noticed that with the Breton music as well. Fabulous stuff.
If you become a musician, you'll find that in Irish music specifically, I found you can get into the groove and you do go to another world.
You do.
You do go to another world. I didn't realize how thin that veil is until I read a book by a guy by what was his name? It's called The Little Country by Charles D. Lint.
Okay.
He writes, it's fiction, but if you've had the experience, you know it's not.
Yeah, I must get that. I mean, music absolutely can send you to another place, and I can imagine the playing of it is even more powerful and transformative because your whole body is given over to creating that sound, and it's because your whole being is kind of producing this beautiful music.
The unfortunate thing is I've had those experiences and I haven't had any sense. And now I hunger and I look and I search. I do a lot of walking in the woods and always looking and searching and but there's always been a touch. There's, I don't know, there must have been an experience that I no longer remember when I was a child because when I go wandering in the wild, I always receive a gift. Usually, a really brilliant, beautiful feather will appear laying in front of me, or a really close-up encounter with some form of wildlife.
Oh, beautiful.
So
Yeah.
all that has stuck with me. So it's interesting and it's a bit scary. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Facing nature in that way. Well, maybe you might remember your childhood experience someday.
Someday I hope so. Yeah.
Does your son remember much of his experience with Prickleaf?
He remembers Prickle Leaf, but I think more from the statue and the pillow now.
Yeah.
And it's wrapped up, I'm sure, now with the grief and regret of losing his mom.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
But then on the other hand, my grandchild is named Finn, and she's a beautiful little girl.
Oh, that's fab. Great. And, good Irish names as well.
Yeah.
Did you say his name is Brendan?
Brendan. Yeah.
Right. And Finn?
He's Finn. Yeah.
Beautiful. When he was traveling back in the car and when you got him home, did he continue to play with the fairy?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. They had whole conversations. He'd sit in his room playing Legos and, by himself and talking to the fairy. Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's really, really cool. What did that do for his life? Did it bring any changes for him in any way?
I don't think there were any real changes in his life because we were moving around a lot at the time.
Of course.
But I think it kept the child alive in him, even to this day. He still sees the magic and the wonder in life and in the world. Maybe that's what they're supposed to bring.
Yeah, I would say so. It certainly does keep your heart open and connected with nature. And yeah, I think a little bit of magic in your life can do wonders for you, really. I think it enriches life for sure. And it makes you realize kind of what is important too. That, lots of the distractions and the difficulties and the challenges we go through can be relieved so much by, as you say, walking in nature and connecting with the wild. Then you see what this world is really about and the beauty that's there. And it's very healing and very grounding. Oh, well, thank you very much. Yeah, it's fascinating about the one under the tree. And just, of course, you weren't looking at that moment,
No,
were
I
you? It
wasn't
just
looking,
happened.
not at all. No. And to this day, I have no doubt it, it was Faye. I have no doubt whatsoever.
Time to
Thanks to our great guest for sharing their encounters and memories. The first hallucinogenic induced experience with the squirrels reflects that of many other otherworldly encounters. Whether with beings that are described as fairy-like or alien-like, they often contain elements of teachings which warn of an eco-crisis or provide insight about the oneness of nature, human beings, and experience of living on this earth in all its fullness. These numinous experiences are transformative. They open people's minds and hearts to the knowledge that perceived divisions between us are simply distracting illusions, and the truth is that we are all one. The encounter with the Fey musician is very interesting, and there are many accounts which relate experiences with unusually tall beings who seem otherworldly, and after communion of some kind will disappear. What's interesting to note is that whereas one person may describe them as fairies, another will define them as ghosts, and still others may interpret them as alien beings. Another reminder that there is a blur between these sorts of phenomena. One thing that ties them all together is the unmistakable sense of otherworldliness. Here's a couple of excerpts from Simon Young's Fairy Investigation Society census, which is still running and can be found online. Links in the show notes at scarletofthefay.com. This one took place in Connecticut in the US in the 1980s. The informant was up to the age of 10 and it was a female. I was playing in the woods and climbed up a large glacial rock. On a rock ledge was a tall, thin man, 6.5 feet at least. He was oddly dressed and looked not quite human. He had 6 fingers on each hand. I sat down next to him and we talked for a while. I don't remember what we talked about. I finally climbed down the rock, and when I looked back up, he was gone. This one was from New Jersey in the 1970s, and again, a child that was under 10. I was playing under the dogwood tree in my grandparents' back garden, tossing marbles up into the branches and watching them fall and bounce on the moss around its roots. It was late afternoon, the sun was shining, but light was filtered through the leaves of the many large trees that arched over the grass. One of the marbles I tossed up didn't come down, so I tossed another, and it too did not come down. I did this 5 or 6 times, and then I felt a presence in the way that people say they feel a ghost arrive. A chill, the hair on my arms standing up, that sort of thing. Out of the corner of my eye I saw movement at the wooden fence that enclosed the garden. I looked up, and there were 3 people standing on the other side of the fence. 2 were taller than the adults I knew. 1 was shorter. They shimmered in the light, so I couldn't see their faces, but it was obvious they were wearing strange clothes. They just stood there watching me, and I watched them. I wasn't afraid at all. It was as though they knew me. None of us moved until one marble fell out of the tree and landed at my feet. I looked down, surprised, and when I looked back up, they were gone. The next day I went back to the dogwood tree. All of the marbles I'd lost the day before were in a neat circle on the moss. The childhood experience with prickle leaf is very sweet, though I wouldn't recommend attempting to capture fairies, as that could all go very wrong. However, this little boy is destined to meet a wise old woman at a market. She tells him where to find the fairies, and one appears to come home with him. If everything is always as it should be, then perhaps we can assume that the fairy wanted to come on an adventure with that little boy all along. In any case, there seems to be this lovely playful relationship between the little boy and Prickle Leaf, which his parents allow him to explore. In my opinion, an example of great parenting. Children appear to come into this life with the ability to see what is perhaps really there before our senses become dulled through socialization, being continually aligned with what norms are expected within our Western culture. If you can encourage your child to describe their own everyday experience from their own perspective, and you listen fully, you can sometimes learn a great deal. Many people describe having had imaginary friends as children. I'm going to read some excerpts from Marjorie T. Johnson's Seeing Fairies, a truly wonderful book for anyone interested in reading real-life accounts. When she was young, Mrs. Carol Haynes of Shropshire used to spend hours alone with nature. The lovely fields and a dingle with a brook and a waterfall provided a playground that could not be bettered, for it was peopled with creatures that she wouldn't have changed for any other playmates. She remembered the name of one little fellow because her mother tried to make her say Arthur when she insisted he was called Harther. He stood about 18 inches tall, and his dress seemed part of him. This varied with the seasons, although she couldn't remember seeing him during the winter when there was snow on the ground. His speech was like the sighing of wind in the fir trees, and had a fascination for animals. "That's how I came to play with the rabbits and the birds," explained Mrs. Hayes. "The rabbits came and sat at my feet, and the birds on my hands." As she grew older, her mind became filled with mundane matters, and she didn't see any of her little friends until many years later, when she and an aunt were walking in the country. The aunt was chattering away when Mrs. Hayes saw the head of a nature spirit peep out of the hedgerow. She couldn't resist it. She whispered, "A rabbit," and putting her hand in the hedge, she brought out a fine baby bunny, which had been popped into her hand by the little being whose head she had seen. She showed it to her aunt before letting it go free, and her aunt was thrilled. She thought her niece had some power of a kind that brought rabbits out of hats, and Mrs. Hayes said she would never be able to explain to her aunt what really happened. Mrs. Mabel Gillespie's son, Thomas, used to see fairies in his native Galloway, mostly near the house and in the garden. Especially he liked the lady fairies, as he called them, and the way the fairies helped to show the birds where to get food and berries in wintry weather. On one occasion, at the age of 10, he brought Mrs. Gillespie some flowers and explained that a fairy had said, "Give these to your mother." Many years ago, when Mrs. George E. Rice and his late wife lived in Middlesex, they were invited to spend an afternoon with Dr. Outram, a lady doctor of philosophy, at her home in Shenley, in Hertfordshire. Dr. Outram had been told by a well-known London medium that she had a fairy dell in her grounds, and this interested her because her lodgekeeper's little son, aged 4, kept on telling his mother that he played with the fairies. Having heard that Mr. Rice's wife was a gifted medium, Dr. Outram was eager for her to see the fairy dell, so thither Mr. and Mrs. Rice went with their younger daughter a few weeks later, and they and their hostess sat close to an old oak tree and waited. The dell consisted of a double line of trees with grass instead of a road between, and the little party had been there about 2 hours when Mrs. Rice exclaimed, "I see them. They are little brownies, and they are coming out of that hollow tree over there." She pointed to a tree on the other side of the grassway. "They're bringing out a maypole. They've set it up and are dancing round it, intertwining the ribbons and shouting just as children do." Dr. Outram sat wide-eyed, staring in amazement at Mrs. Rice, and then, in awed tones, she said, "That is exactly what my lodgekeeper's little boy has been telling his mother." Now this last story is, I feel, a rather beautiful one. Memories of regularly seeing fairies in the home as a child. It ends with what I would describe as a good death, surrounded by loved ones, although it is very sad, and so I tell you ahead of time in case that's too raw to hear at the moment. a well-known children's psychiatrist, who for professional reasons preferred to remain anonymous, told me that she had seen fairies all her life, and that she and her twin brother used to spend many hours observing the little people in the country round their home, which was in southern Ireland and was on the verge of a great bog. The little elves loved the peat fires, she said. They would sit cross-legged on the nursery hearth, holding out their tiny hands to the blaze, and chuckling to each other when the sparks flew and the turves fell in the warmth of the flames. As far back as I can remember, there was always a baby in the heavy hooded oak cradled by the fireside, and Sarah, our Irish nurse, sat and sewed by candlelight in the soft Irish dusk. For nursery tea, we had cake one day and jam or golden syrup the next. On golden syrup days, the slices of bread were cut in the kitchen early in the day, spread with syrup and stacked on the plate, so that the syrup soaked right through the bread. I remember joking with my brother at the sight of a little gnome sitting on the edge of the plate, holding his mouth open to catch the drops of syrup from an overhanging slice of bread. There were the Christmas tree fairies, the Easter grotto fairies, the fairies who guided folk through the bog, and the undines who danced in the waterfalls. They were all quite different from each other. They were busy all day, and their movements were swift and sure. They were like children in comparison with those greater beings, the angels, who moved with such dignity and light. There came a time when my father decided to go and live in England. The hustle of moving hardly reached the nursery until the day when we all boarded the ship in Cork Harbour to begin a new life among strangers. My mother was a harpist, and the great instrument in its green baize cover stood beside us on the deck. It was difficult to settle down in England. My mother missed the warmth of the Irish people, the rough country scenes, and the soft Irish rain. She became ill, and one day just before my 7th birthday, Sarah took us all into the room to say goodbye. Although it was a winter evening, the room was strangely light. A soft radiance flooded my mother's face and enveloped the tiny face, which was all we could see, of the baby lying in the crook of her arm. We, the 6 children, waited in silence beside Sarah. My father stood as motionless as a statue by the side of the bed. My mother beckoned, and Sarah went forward and lifted the baby from her arms. She murmured goodbye, then held out her hands to my father, who clasped them in his own until my mother's smile faded and she was at rest. At that moment, 50 or more fairy people, holding a shimmering blue cover, came instantly forward and drew the wonderful gauze over the bed and the still figure. The light faded and the room felt cold. Then from the corner came the clear notes of my mother's harp. Baby Michael grew into a quiet dream boy. He had a love for all living things, and it was he who pointed out to us the fairies in the herb walk, and the gnomes picking the fruit off the low bushes and quarrelling with the birds for the best specimens. I do not see the fairies now as I often did, but they do pay me a visit occasionally. I think at times like these it's good to be reminded that the passing away of loved ones can be handled with respect and honour, and most of all, love. From one perspective, these are transitions from one state to another. If you have ever had the honour of observing a loved one pass over, you may understand that afterwards, although you sense they are gone physically, you can in fact sense them in everything around you. And although you feel that aching, raw loss, there is solace and healing when you find that they are present in the birdsong, the breeze, and on rare occasions you can feel them walking right beside you. Even in death, love remains. Always remain curious.